At 65, I discovered that my husband of 42 years had secretly proposed to his high school sweetheart, the woman he'd dated before me, and apparently never truly forgotten. When I stood up in that flower-filled chapel on a sunny Saturday morning, interrupting their vows with 3 devastating truths that silenced the entire congregation, I never imagined that exactly 3 weeks later, I'd be sitting across from both of them at my kitchen table, planning a future none of us could have, envisioned in our wildest dreams. Before I continue with this story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had to confront a painful truth in your life, make sure you're subscribed, because next week, I'm sharing the aftermath that even my closest friends couldn't believe. This photograph was taken at our 40th anniversary celebration 2 years ago. There I am in my emerald green dress, standing beside Harold at the country club. Everyone's smiling, champagne glasses raised in celebration. I thought we were entering our golden years together, with the hard parts of life behind us. I was wrong. My mother always told me, "Margaret, pay attention to what people do, not what they say. Actions reveal the truth that words often try to hide." Her wisdom became my lifeline on that April morning when I stood in the back of a chapel, watching my husband prepare to marry another woman. After I retired from my position as hospital administrator, our relationship shifted. Harold, still working part-time at the architectural firm he'd founded, began spending more evenings at the office. Our comfortable dinner conversations turned into brief exchanges. The silence we'd once enjoyed now felt heavy with distance, the cow. Warning signs appeared when Harold started talking about Patricia Sullivan, a woman from his past who had recently moved back to town after her husband's death. "Just an old friend," he called her. "Pat was always easy to talk to," he'd say casually, as if reconnecting with a high school girlfriend after 50 years was the most natural thing in the world. What Harold didn't know was that I had seen the way his eyes lit up when he mentioned her name, a light I hadn't seen when he looked at me in years. I noticed the extra care he took with his appearance on days he was meeting colleagues for lunch. Small things, perhaps, but after 42 years of marriage, I recognized the signs of a heart turning elsewhere. The crisis came on a Tuesday afternoon. Harold had left his laptop open on his desk, something he never did, with his email visible. I wasn't looking for evidence. I was simply going to close the computer when a message caught my eye. Wedding venue confirmed for April 16th. The sender, Patricia Sullivan. My hand froze above the keyboard. Wedding venue? With a trembling finger, I clicked on the message. "Harold, darling. The chapel is confirmed for April 16th at 11 a.m. The minister has our revised vows. I can hardly believe that after all these years, we'll finally be together as we were always meant to be. These past 6 months have been the happiest of my life." The room seemed to tilt sideways. 6 months. While I had been adjusting to retirement, volunteering at the community garden, and trying not to worry about Harold's increasing emotional absence, he had been planning a new life with his first love. There were more emails, dozens of them, stretching back months. Plans for a quiet ceremony, arrangements to sell our house while I was scheduled to visit my sister in Arizona, discussions about which possessions he would take and which he would leave for me to make the transition easier. I read about Patricia's waterfront condo where they would live, their planned cruise to the Mediterranean once everything was settled, and most painfully, Harold's repeated assurances that he had never stopped loving her, that their separation 50 years ago had been the greatest mistake of his life. My friend Judith found me there hours later, still staring at the laptop, my tea long cold beside me. I had called her in a daze, unable to process what I had discovered. "He's been leading a double life," I told her, my voice sounding strange, even to my own ears. Planning to leave me, to marry her, without ever having a single honest conversation about what was wrong between us. Judith's outrage was immediate. "You need to confront him tonight, throw him out, call a lawyer." But as the initial shock began to recede, I found myself filled not just with hurt and anger, but with a strange clarity. This wasn't just about Harold's betrayal. It was about truth and consequences. "No," I said finally. "I'm not going to confront him yet." "What do you mean?" Judith asked, bewildered. "You can't just pretend you don't know." "I'm not going to pretend anything," I told her, a plan forming in my mind. "But if Harold wants a wedding, then I think he should have one, with all the truth that he's been avoiding laid bare in front of everyone he cares about." Over the next 10 days, I maintained a careful facade of normalcy, while Harold continued his elaborate deceptions. Business dinners that didn't exist, weekend conferences that never appeared on his firm's calendar, even a fabricated trip to see our son in Chicago that would give him the time to get married before I was any the wiser. I used that time to learn everything I could about Patricia Sullivan. I discovered that she and Harold had dated seriously in high school and college, that Harold had actually proposed to her before she chose a scholarship abroad over marriage. I found out about her successful career as a gallery owner, her late husband's substantial insurance policy, and most importantly, the location and time of the wedding. The morning of April 16th dawned bright and clear. Harold had left 2 days earlier for his Chicago trip, kissing me goodbye with practiced ease. I dressed carefully in a blue suit I knew Harold had always admired and drove to the small chapel on the edge of town where my husband of 42 years was preparing to begin a new life built entirely on lies. As I parked my car and saw the small gathering of people entering the chapel, most of whom I recognized as Harold's colleagues and friends, people who had been to our home for dinner, I felt a strange, calm descend. I wasn't there to make a scene or to beg Harold to return. I was there for something far more important: truth. What I couldn't know as I walked toward that chapel, my heart pounding but my steps steady, was that my appearance at this wedding would set in motion events that none of us could have anticipated, leading to revelations that would ultimately transform not just my life, but Harold's and Patricia's as well. The chapel was smaller than I expected, an intimate setting with stained glass windows casting colored light across oak pews. I slipped in quietly through the side entrance as a string quartet played softly. Only about 30 people were present, all focused on the front where Harold stood beside the minister, his back straight, his silver hair catching the light. Recognized most of the guests, colleagues from Harold's firm, golf partners, couples we'd socialized with for decades. Not one of them looked surprised to be at Harold's wedding to another woman. The realization that they had all accepted this deception, perhaps even facilitated it, sent a wave of ice through my veins. How long had everyone known except me? Taking a seat in the last row, I watched as the chapel doors opened and Patricia Sullivan began her walk down the aisle. She was elegant in a champagne-colored dress, her silver blonde hair swept up, a small bouquet of lilies in her hands. I had to admit she was beautiful, vibrant and poised in a way that spoke of confidence earned through a lifetime of success. As she approached Harold, I saw his face transform. It wasn't just happiness I witnessed. It was relief. Relief that soon he would be free of the charade he'd been living, free of the wife he hadn't bothered to divorce before planning his new beginning. The minister smiled benevolently at the couple, then addressed the gathering. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of Harold and Patricia, whose paths have crossed again after many years apart." I sat perfectly still, my breath even, waiting for the right moment. The right moment came sooner than I expected. If anyone can show just cause why this couple should not be lawfully joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional words hung in the air. In movies, this is where the jilted lover bursts in dramatically, shouting objections. But I didn't need to shout. I simply stood up, my blue suit making me instantly visible against the mahogany pews. "Have something to say," I announced, my voice clear and steady. Harold whipped around, his face draining of color as he saw me. Patricia turned more slowly, confusion clouding her features before recognition dawned. The guests shifted uncomfortably, murmuring in shock. "Margaret," Harold gasped, his voice strangled. "What are you—" "I'm here to share 3 truths before—" "You continue," I interrupted, walking slowly down the aisle toward them. "3 things everyone in this room deserves to know." The minister looked between Harold and me, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I don't understand." "I'm Harold's wife," I said simply. "His current wife. We've been married for 42 years, and he hasn't bothered to divorce me before arranging this ceremony." The collective intake of breath from the guests was audible. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock as she turned to Harold. "You told me your divorce was finalized months ago," she whispered, loud enough for those in the front rows to hear. Harold's face had moved from shock to anger. "Margaret, this is completely inappropriate. We can discuss this privately." "Like you've been discussing your wedding plans privately?" I asked, now standing just a few feet from them. "Like you've been discussing selling our house while I'm visiting my sister? Or perhaps like you've been discussing which of our possessions you plan to leave me in the divorce you never actually filed for?" Several guests stood up, clearly unsure whether to leave or stay for what was rapidly becoming the most dramatic event our social circle had witnessed in decades. "That's the first truth," I continued, my voice unwavering. "Harold is still legally married to me, making this ceremony not just inappropriate but potentially criminal." Harold's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The minister stepped back, clearly wanting no part of the unfolding disaster. "The second truth," I said, turning slightly to address Patricia directly, "is that Harold has been systematically draining our joint accounts for the past 4 months. The retirement fund we built together over 4 decades, the one he told you was his personal investment portfolio, has been reduced by nearly 60%. Patricia's eyes widened further as she turned to Harold, whose face was now flushed, with a mixture of rage and embarrassment. "She's upset," he managed, reaching for Patricia's hand. "She's making this sound worse than—" "The transactions are documented," I interrupted calmly. "All $437,000 of them. I've provided copies to our son Michael, our lawyer, and our financial advisor this morning. Which brings me to my third truth." I paused, letting the silence build as Harold's expression shifted from anger to something closer to fear. He knew me well enough to recognize when I was holding the winning hand. "Harold has a heart condition," I said finally. "Diagnosed 6 months ago, around the time you two reconnected, Patricia. He hasn't told you because it would complicate his insurance situation once we divorce. His medications are in his right jacket pocket right now. The ones he told you were just for cholesterol." Patricia's gaze dropped to Harold's jacket, then back to his face, which had gone ashen. "Is this true?" she asked quietly. Harold's silence was answer enough. "I'm not here to stop you from marrying her, Harold," I said, my voice softer now. "I'm here because if you're going to build a new life, it should be built on truth, not lies. Patricia deserves to know who she's really marrying. A man who lies to his wife of 42 years, drains their shared resources, and hides critical health information from his bride-to-be." The silence in the chapel was absolute. Harold seemed to have aged a decade in the past few minutes. His shoulders slumped, his earlier confidence evaporated. "I'll be filing for divorce on Monday," I concluded. "And contrary to what Harold has apparently told you, Patricia, I have no intention of making it easy or quick. Not after this." With that, I turned and began walking back up the aisle. I had said what I came to say, delivered the truths that needed to be spoken. What happened next was up to them. I had almost reached the door when Patricia's voice stopped me. "Margaret, wait." I turned, surprised. Patricia had stepped away from Harold and was moving toward me, her expression unreadable. "Did you know about us all along?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. About Harold and me reconnecting? I knew he was seeing someone, I admitted. I only discovered it was you, and that you were planning to marry 10 days ago, when I found the emails. Patricia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with new resolve. And these things you've said, about the money, about his health. You can prove them? Every word, I confirmed. I've been a hospital administrator for 30 years, Patricia. Documentation is second nature to me. She nodded slowly, then turned to look back at Harold, who stood frozen at the altar, watching us with evident dread. I think, Patricia said carefully, that we all need to have a conversation, not here, not now, but soon. She hesitated, then added with unexpected dignity, Thank you for your honesty. It seems I've been lacking that recently. The murmuring among the guests had grown louder. Some were already gathering their things, eager to escape the uncomfortable situation. Others watched with undisguised fascination, already composing the accounts they would share at their next social gathering. I'll leave you to conclude things here, I said, suddenly exhausted by the emotional toll of the confrontation. You know where to find me when you're ready to talk. As I walked out of the chapel into the bright spring sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not happy. There was too much pain and betrayal for happiness, but unburdened by secrets and lies. Whatever happened next, at least it would happen in the light of truth. My friend Judith was waiting in her car across the street, as we had arranged. Her eyes were wide with nervous anticipation as I slid into the passenger seat. Well? She demanded. What happened? Did you really do it? I did, I confirmed, leaning back against the headrest. I told them everything. And? She pressed, starting the engine. How did Harold react? What did that woman do? I closed my eyes, the events of the past hour already taking on a dreamlike quality. It wasn't what I expected, I admitted. None of it went the way I thought it would. What do you mean? Judith asked, pulling away from the chapel. Did he deny everything? Make a scene? No, I said slowly, trying to make sense of it myself. It was Patricia who surprised me. She thanked me for the truth? Judith snorted in disbelief. Thanked you? For ruining her wedding? For preventing her from making a terrible mistake, I corrected. She didn't know, Judith, about any of it. That we're still married, the money, his health. Harold lied to her just as much as he lied to me. We drove in silence for several minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Judith spoke again, her voice gentler than before. What now, Margaret? What happens next? It was the question I had been avoiding since discovering Harold's betrayal. In the heat of planning my confrontation, I hadn't looked beyond this moment, hadn't considered what my life would be after the dramatic revelation. I don't know, I admitted. Divorce, obviously. Starting over at 65. You'll be all right, Judith said with firm confidence. You're the strongest person I know. As we drove through familiar streets toward my home, the home Harold had been planning to sell without my knowledge, I wondered if Judith was right. Was I strong enough for what lay ahead? And what would Harold do now that his carefully constructed plans had collapsed so publicly? What I couldn't possibly know then, as we pulled into my driveway, my future suddenly unwritten and uncertain, was that within 3 weeks, the three of us would be sitting at my kitchen table having a conversation that would change everything yet again. The day after the wedding confrontation, our house felt unnaturally quiet. I moved through familiar rooms that suddenly seemed alien. The living room where Harold and I had spent countless evenings, the kitchen where we'd prepared meals side by side for decades, the study where he'd drafted architectural plans while I reviewed hospital budgets. Every space held memories now tainted by deception. I hadn't expected Harold to come home after the scene at the chapel. In my imagination, he would retreat to Patricia's waterfront condo, licking his wounds and plotting his next move. So when the doorbell rang late Sunday afternoon, I was surprised to find him standing on our porch, looking every one of his 70 years. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice raspy with fatigue. "We need to talk." I hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. Whatever came next, we did indeed need to talk. Harold moved to his usual armchair, but paused before sitting, as if uncertain of his place in this home he'd been planning to abandon. "I didn't think you'd let me in," he admitted, finally lowering himself into the chair. "I considered changing the locks," I replied honestly, taking a seat across from him. "But I decided that would be petty." He nodded, his gaze fixed on his hands. "You've never been petty, Margaret. That's one of the reasons this is so—" He trailed off, apparently unable to find an adequate word for the situation. "Surprising?" I suggested coldly. "Shocking? Devastating? Humiliating? Take your pick, Harold. I've felt all of those emotions, and more since discovering your emails." His head snapped up. "You read my emails?" The audacity of his indignation after what he'd done sent a flash of anger through me. "Yes, Harold. I read your emails, on your laptop that you left open on your desk. Your secret wedding plans were hardly buried in some hidden folder." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I suppose I've lost the right to privacy complaints. You may?" "Lost a lot more than that," I said quietly. "Why are you here, Harold? What do you want to say that couldn't wait until we meet with the lawyers?" He took a deep breath, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest, a habit I'd observed countless times during our marriage, usually when he was preparing to discuss something difficult. "Patricia called off the wedding," he said finally. "After you left, she asked me about everything you'd said, about us still being married, about the money, about my heart condition. I couldn't deny any of it. I felt a vindication that surprised me in its intensity. I'm not sure what you expected, Harold. That she'd marry you anyway, knowing you'd been lying to her from the beginning?" "I thought I could explain," he said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "Make her understand why I handled things the way I did." "And did she understand?" I asked, already knowing the answer from his defeated posture. He shook his head. "She said she couldn't build a future with someone she couldn't trust. That if I could deceive you so thoroughly after 42 years, she had no reason to believe I wouldn't do the same to her." A bitter laugh escaped him. "She said you did her a favor." The irony wasn't lost on me. In exposing Harold's betrayal, I had inadvertently saved Patricia from making a terrible mistake. There was a certain poetic justice in that outcome. "So you've come to what? Apologize? Beg forgiveness?" I asked, genuinely curious about his intentions. "Or just to collect your things?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. "I've spent 6 months constructing an elaborate fantasy of a new beginning, and in 20 minutes, you demolished it completely. I'm lost, Margaret." Part of me, the wounded, betrayed part, wanted to savor his discomfort, to let him flounder in the consequences of his actions. But another part, the part that had loved this man for most of my adult life, found his confusion almost unbearably sad. "Where are you staying?" I asked, my tone softer than I'd intended. "At the Lakeside Hotel," he replied. "I had it booked as a backup in case there were any issues with moving into Patricia's place right away." He laughed humorlessly. "At least I got one contingency plan right." We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, the weight of 4 decades together and the ruins of our marriage hanging between us. "I never meant to hurt you," Harold finally said, the platitude sounding hollow even to him, judging by his grimace. "That sounds ridiculous after what I've done, I know." "What did you mean to do then?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. Just disappear one day while I was visiting Sarah? Leave a note? Have your lawyer call me? He flinched at each question. I told myself you'd be fine, he admitted. That you're so independent, so capable, that you might even be relieved to be free of me. That after the initial shock, you'd rebuild your life and be happier. The sheer self-serving nature of his rationalization left me momentarily speechless. When I found my voice again, it was steady with controlled anger. That's quite a story you told yourself, Harold. Very convenient. It allowed you to pursue what you wanted without facing the reality of what you were doing to me. I leaned forward, holding his gaze. But let's be clear, you weren't thinking about my happiness. You were thinking about avoiding the discomfort of an honest conversation, of proper divorce proceedings, of dividing assets fairly. He didn't deny it, which was perhaps the first honest thing he'd done in months. The heart condition, I continued, watching him carefully. When were you diagnosed? Last October, he said quietly. Atrial fibrillation with early signs of heart failure. Not immediately life-threatening with medication, but progressive. The cardiologist said I could have many good years with proper treatment, or fewer if I'm not careful. And you reconnected with Patricia. In November, he admitted. At T, the alumni fundraiser for State University. She'd just moved back after Edward's death. The timeline confirmed what I had suspected, that his mortality had triggered this desperate grasp at the road not taken, this attempt to recapture the youth, and possibilities that Patricia represented. Did you ever love me, Harold? The question escaped before I could consider whether I really wanted the answer. His head snapped up, genuine surprise in his expression. Of course I did, Margaret. I still do, in my way. In your way, I repeated, flatly. Which apparently includes betrayal, theft, and abandonment. He winced. I deserve that. But it doesn't change the fact that we built a life together that meant something. That still means something. Not enough to be honest with me, I observed. Not enough to give me the dignity of a conversation before planning to leave. Harold rose abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked our garden. The garden we'd planned and planted together over decades, watching it mature just as our relationship had. I was a coward, he said finally, his back to me. I didn't want to see your pain, to deal with your anger or disappointment, so I convinced myself that a clean break would be better for both of us. He turned back to face me. I was wrong, Margaret, terribly wrong. The admission hung in the air between us, insufficient as an apology, but perhaps the first honest thing he'd said to me in months. What do you want now, Harold? I asked, suddenly exhausted by the emotional toll of the conversation. Why did you really come here today? He hesitated, then spoke with unexpected directness. I came to ask if there's any possibility of salvaging something from the wreckage I've created. Not our marriage. I know that's destroyed. But some kind of peace between us. Some way forward that isn't just attorneys and acrimony. The request surprised me. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps even accusations. Not this quiet plea for reconciliation of a sort. I don't know, I answered honestly. Right now, I can barely look at you without remembering every email I read, every lie you told, every moment you were with me while planning to leave. That's not something I can just set aside because your other plans fell through. He nodded slowly, accepting this without argument. I understand. But Margaret, there's something else you should know. He hesitated, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Patricia called me this morning. She wants to meet with both of us. Both of us? I echoed, genuinely startled. Why on earth would she want that? She said. Harold paused, clearly uncomfortable. She said that we all need to have an honest conversation about the future, that there are practical matters to discuss. A chill ran through me at his words. What practical matters could possibly involve all three of us? She wouldn't say over the phone, Harold replied, but she was insistent that the three of us meet, preferably soon. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them particularly appealing. What could Patricia Sullivan possibly want to discuss with both me and the man who had nearly married her under false pretenses? I don't think I'm ready for that, I said finally. The last 24 hours have been quite enough. Drama for me? Harold nodded, disappointment evident in his expression but making no attempt to persuade me. I'll tell her you need time. Though what? I prompted when he trailed off. She mentioned something about information that affects all three of us. Something she discovered after looking more closely at some documents I'd given her. He shrugged helplessly. I don't know what she meant, but she seemed to think it was important. The cryptic message piqued my curiosity, despite my reluctance. What could Patricia have discovered that would necessitate a meeting between all three of us? What information could possibly connect us beyond the obvious triangle of betrayal? I'll think about it, I conceded. But not today. Today I need you to leave, Harold. I need space to process everything that's happened. He accepted this without argument, rising slowly from his chair. For what it's worth, Margaret, watching you stand up in that chapel yesterday, seeing your dignity and courage even in the face of what I'd done, it made me realize how much I've lost. Not just a wife, but a woman of extraordinary character. The compliment, unexpected and seemingly sincere, caught me off guard. Flattery won't change anything, Harold. It's not flattery, he said quietly, moving toward the door. Just a truth I should have appreciated more while I had the chance. As the door closed behind him, I remained seated, trying to make sense of the conversation and what it meant for my future. Harold's world had collapsed spectacularly, but that gave me no real satisfaction. Only a hollow vindication that did. Nothing to fill the void his betrayal had created in my life. And now this mysterious message from Patricia. What could she possibly have discovered that warranted a meeting between all three of us? Part of me wanted nothing to do with either of them ever again. But another part, the problem solver who had managed a hospital for decades, couldn't help but wonder what information could be so important. Little did I know that when I finally agreed to that meeting a week later, the revelation Patricia brought to my kitchen table would change everything, not just for me, but for all three of us in ways none of us could have anticipated. A week passed in a strange limbo. I consulted with my attorney about divorce proceedings, called our son Michael to explain the situation, a conversation that left him stunned and furious with his father, and tried to envision what my life might look like going forward. Harold remained at the Lakeside Hotel, texting occasionally but respecting my request for space. I thought often about Patricia's mysterious message, the information that affects all three of us. Curiosity warred with my desire to keep my distance from both Harold and the woman he'd nearly married. Ultimately, curiosity won. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I texted Harold that I was ready to meet with Patricia. By afternoon, arrangements had been made for her to come to my house, our house, the following day. I spent that evening in a state of nervous anticipation, meticulously cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, rearranging items on shelves, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind raced with possibilities. What could Patricia possibly have discovered? Financial malfeasance beyond what I already knew? Some health issue more serious than Harold had admitted? Or something else? Entirely? When the doorbell rang at precisely 10 a.m. on Wednesday, I took a deep breath before answering. Patricia stood on my porch looking markedly different from the poised bride I'd confronted at the chapel. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back simply, her makeup minimal, her elegant style replaced by a practical pantsuit. Behind her, Harold hovered awkwardly, looking like a chastened schoolboy rather than the confident architect I'd been married to for decades. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Patricia said as I invited them in. Her voice was measured, professional. The gallery owner accustomed to difficult negotiations. I led them to the kitchen rather than the living room, instinctively choosing the most neutral territory in the house. We settled around the oak table where our family had shared countless meals, the familiarity of the setting making the strangeness of our trio all the more pronounced. Patricia placed a leather portfolio on the table, her hands resting lightly on top of it. "I appreciate your willingness to talk, Margaret. I know this situation is unprecedented for all of us." "That's one word for it," I replied, my tone cooler than I'd intended. "Harold said you discovered something that concerns all three of us. I'm curious what that could possibly be." She exchanged a glance with Harold, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Should I?" he began, but Patricia shook her head. "I'll explain," she said firmly. Opening the portfolio, she removed several documents and placed them carefully on the table. When Harold and I reconnected last fall, he shared some information about his financial situation as part of our planning. Her slight hesitation on the last word acknowledged the delicacy of discussing their marriage plans in my kitchen. He mentioned an investment portfolio that had performed extraordinarily well enough to fund our retirement plans. I nodded, already aware of this from the emails I'd read. "The joint account he drained without my knowledge." Harold winced, but didn't contradict me. "Yes," Patricia confirmed. "But here's where things get complicated. After your appearance at the chapel, I started looking more closely at those financial documents. As Edward's widow, I'm familiar with investment management. My late husband was meticulous about financial planning." She slid one of the documents toward me. It was a statement from Meridian Partners, an investment firm I recognized as one Harold had mentioned occasionally over the years. "Harold gave me this as proof of his financial stability," Patricia continued. "But when I examined it more carefully, I noticed some irregularities in the reporting format. Small things most people wouldn't catch. Inconsistent fonts, misaligned columns, dates that didn't quite match up." I glanced at Harold, whose face had gone pale. "You forged financial statements?" I asked, incredulous despite everything else he'd done. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I enhanced them," Patricia continued, her tone matter-of-fact. "The performance he claimed, consistent 18% annual returns over a decade, seemed implausible. So I contacted Meridian directly, posing as Harold's assistant. What I discovered was unexpected." She pulled out another document, an official statement from Meridian Partners with their letterhead. "The account exists, but with significantly less impressive performance than Harold claimed. Instead of $2.4 million, it holds approximately $840,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Even accounting for the money Harold had withdrawn recently, this was far less than I had believed we had set aside for retirement. "But that's not all," Patricia said, her expression grave as she placed a third document on the table. "This is where it affects all three of us. When I pressed for more information, the account manager revealed something Harold apparently didn't. No. The investment policies had been changed 3 years ago, with a new beneficiary designation added." "New beneficiary?" I echoed, confused. "Who?" Patricia met my eyes directly. "Crestview Senior Living Community. It's an irrevocable designation, meaning it can't be changed without their consent. According to the documentation, Harold donated the account to establish a Wilson Family Legacy fund that guarantees lifetime care for both of you in their premier facility." I stared at her, then at Harold, struggling to process this information. "That's impossible," I said finally. "I never agreed to any such arrangement." Harold's shoulders slumped further. "You did, actually," he admitted. "Remember the estate planning package we updated after my 70th birthday? The documents our attorney sent over?" A vague memory stirred. A thick stack of papers I'd signed during a particularly busy week at the hospital. Harold had assured me they were standard updates to our will and financial arrangements, nothing that required detailed scrutiny. You buried this in routine paperwork? I asked, my voice rising with disbelief. Why would you do that without discussing it with me? Harold ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking every day of his 70 years. Because I was afraid, he said simply. Afraid of getting old, of becoming dependent, of being a burden. My father spent his final years in a terrible nursing home because he hadn't planned properly. I was determined that wouldn't happen to us. So you, what? Secretly earmarked our retirement savings for a senior living facility without telling me? The betrayal felt almost as significant as his planned abandonment. I thought I was protecting our future, he insisted. Crestview is the best facility in the region. Private rooms, excellent medical care, activities, independence for as long as possible. The Legacy Fund guarantees we'll never be without care, no matter how long we live or what health problems develop. Patricia cleared her throat, drawing our attention back to her. The issue now is that this arrangement complicates everything. The fund is irrevocable, with legally binding contracts. It can't be divided in a divorce. And more importantly, she hesitated, then continued carefully, it's tied to your marriage. What do you mean? I asked, a sense of foreboding growing. The Legacy Fund documentation specifies that the guaranteed care is for Harold and Margaret Wilson as a married couple. If you divorce, the terms change significantly. You would both still have access to care, but at a much reduced level, in shared accommodations rather than the private suite reserved for you. And a substantial portion of the fund would revert to Crestview's general endowment. Silence fell, as the implications became clear. Our retirement security, the financial foundation I had believed was solid, was now inextricably tied to a marriage that had been shattered by betrayal. So what you're saying, I finally managed, is that divorcing Harold would not only divide our remaining assets but would also jeopardize my long-term care options. Essentially, yes, Patricia confirmed. The attorneys I consulted were quite clear on that point. It's an unusual arrangement, but legally binding. I turned to Harold, anger building again. You manipulated me into an arrangement that effectively trapped me in our marriage? No, he protested, looking genuinely distressed. That was never my intention. I truly believed we would grow old together, that the Legacy Fund would provide security for both of us. Divorce wasn't even a consideration when I set this up. Just like it wasn't a consideration when you proposed to Patricia, I countered. He had no answer for that. Patricia watched our exchange with an unreadable expression. There's one more complication, she said after a moment. The account manager mentioned that they've nearly completed construction on a new wing at Crestview, the one where your suite would be located. They're expecting you both to move in within the next 6 months, as specified in the agreement. 6 months? I echoed, stunned. That's impossible. I had no plans to retire from consulting for at least another 2 years, let alone move to a senior living facility. The agreement stipulates occupancy beginning in October of this year, Patricia confirmed. Apparently, there was some correspondence about this last year that Harold handled. Harold nodded reluctantly. They sent information packets and invitations to tour the new facilities. I filed them away. With everything else happening, I hadn't thought about how to address the timeline. The sheer magnitude of decisions Harold had made unilaterally left me momentarily speechless. Not only had he planned to abandon me, but he had also committed us to a living arrangement I knew nothing about, leveraging our retirement savings in ways that severely limited my options. Let me make sure I understand, I said finally. Our retirement savings are largely locked into this legacy fund. If we remain married, we get premium care for life in private accommodations. If we divorce, we both get reduced care and lose a significant portion of the investment, and either way, we're expected to move in by October. That's the situation as I understand it, Patricia confirmed. I thought you should know before proceeding with divorce plans. I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb the implications. Why are you doing this, Patricia? Why go to all this trouble to uncover this information and share it with us? How? Does this benefit you? Her expression softened slightly. Because I know what it's like to be blindsided by financial realities at our age. When Edward died, I discovered he'd made investment decisions I knew nothing about. Some good, some disastrous. It took me 2 years to untangle the mess and secure my future. She glanced at Harold, then back to me. I don't like being lied to, but I also don't want to see another woman's financial security destroyed because of a man's poor decisions. The unexpected solidarity between women who should have been enemies caught me off guard. Thank you, I said simply. For the information, if nothing else? She nodded, gathering the documents and returning them to her portfolio. I should go. You two clearly have a lot to discuss. Rising from the table, she paused. For what it's worth, Margaret, I admire the courage it took to stand up in that chapel. Not many would have had that strength. After she left, Harold and I sat in stunned silence, the ticking of the kitchen clock unnaturally loud in the quiet house. I don't know whether to thank you for securing our retirement or strangle you for doing it in secret, I finally said. A shadow of his old wry humor crossed his face. Given the circumstances, I'd understand either reaction. How could you make such monumental decisions without even consulting me? I asked, the fundamental betrayal still incomprehensible despite everything else that had happened. I thought, I was doing the right thing, he said quietly. Securing our future. My father's decline was horrible, Margaret. Watching him waste away in that understaffed facility, with no dignity, no quality of life. I've been terrified of that happening to us. His vulnerability might have moved me under different circumstances. Now, it just added another layer to my confusion. And yet you were planning to leave me, I pointed out. How does that square with your concern for my future care? Harold stared at his hands. I told myself you'd be fine financially. That between your pension, our savings, and the house, you'd have enough. I never considered the legacy fund because… He trailed off. Because you'd forgotten about it? I suggested incredulously. Because I couldn't bear to think about growing old at all, he admitted. The heart diagnosis hit me harder than I let on. Suddenly, mortality wasn't abstract anymore. When I reconnected with Patricia, it felt like a second chance at youth, at possibilities. I convinced myself I could outrun time itself. The sad desperation in his confession stirred unwelcome empathy. I recognized the fear he described, the dread of decline that haunts everyone our age. But where I had faced it directly, Harold had tried to escape through fantasy and deception. So now what? I asked, the practical administrator in me emerging despite my emotional turmoil. What happens next? Harold looked up, his expression cautious. That depends on you, I suppose. If you proceed with the divorce, we both face diminished circumstances at Crestview. If we stay married… He left the alternative hanging. If we stay married, I continued sharply, I'm supposed to just forgive the lies, the betrayal, the fact that you were willing to abandon me without a backward glance? That's quite a price for a private suite at a retirement home, Harold. He winced at my blunt assessment. I know I've destroyed your trust. I know I've caused damage that may be irreparable. I'm not asking for forgiveness I haven't earned. Then, what are you asking for? I pressed. Harold was silent for a long moment, considering his words carefully. A third option, he said finally. One that Patricia suggested before you arrived today. My suspicion immediately flared. You two were plotting something before this meeting? Not plotting, he corrected quickly. She approached me with an idea, one that might address our practical concerns while acknowledging the reality of our situation. Curiosity overcame my initial defensiveness. What kind of idea? A different kind of arrangement, Harold said carefully. One where we remain legally married for the purposes of the legacy fund, but with adjusted expectations and boundaries. You mean a marriage in name only? I clarified, trying to understand what he was suggesting. Something like that. We would present as a couple for Crestviews purposes, sharing the suite as planned, but internally we would have separate spaces, separate lives to the extent possible, a practical partnership rather than a romantic one. The proposal was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond immediately. A marriage of convenience with the man who had betrayed me seemed absurd on its face. And yet the practical benefits were undeniable. Financial security, premium care, maintaining the life we had planned for our later years. And this was Patricia's suggestion? I asked, still trying to process the concept. Harold nodded. She said it's not uncommon among people our age. Practical arrangements to address healthcare and financial realities. Called it a conscious uncoupling without the legal complications. Despite everything, a surprised laugh escaped me. That sounds like something from a self-help book. She mentioned something about celebrity divorces, Harold admitted with a small smile. I didn't follow all the references. The moment of shared amusement felt bizarrely normal amid the wreckage of our marriage, a brief reminder of the ease we'd once had together. It dissipated quickly, reality reasserting itself. I can't make a decision like this today, I said, firmly. I need to think, to talk to my attorney, to understand all the implications. Of course, Harold agreed quickly. Take whatever time you need. I'll stay at the hotel. As he rose to leave, he hesitated. There's one more thing, Patricia. Suggested. Something I think you should consider regardless of what you decide about our legal status. What's that? That you and she meet, without me. She said sometimes women understand each other in ways men can't comprehend, that you might have questions for her that would be easier to ask if I weren't present. The suggestion was surprisingly thoughtful. I did have questions for Patricia, about her relationship with Harold, about what she had known and when, about why she had chosen to help me despite everything. I'll think about it, I said noncommittally. After Harold left, I sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the remnants of the life we had built together, the cherished pottery we'd collected on vacations, the calendar marking our granddaughter's birthday next month, the photographs chronicling decades of shared experiences. The practical arrangement Harold had described offered a solution to our financial dilemma. But could I really live in close proximity to a man who had betrayed me so completely? Could we create a new kind of partnership from the ashes of our marriage? And what of Patricia? What was her true motivation in uncovering this information and offering this unusual solution? Was she merely being practical, or was there something more driving her involvement in our complicated situation? As I made myself a cup of tea and watched rain begin to fall in the garden Harold and I had tended together for decades, I realized that the answers to these questions would determine not just my financial security, but the shape of whatever life remained ahead of me. What I couldn't possibly know then, sitting alone in my kitchen with my world upended, was that the conversation Patricia had suggested would lead to revelations even more surprising than what I'd learned today, creating possibilities I could never have imagined when I stood up in that chapel just 2 weeks ago. 3 days after the revelation about the legacy fund, I found myself sitting across from Patricia Sullivan at a small cafe on the opposite side of town from where I normally went, a deliberate choice to avoid running into mutual acquaintances. I'd finally agreed to meet her alone, driven by questions that wouldn't leave me in peace. Patricia arrived precisely on time, dressed in a simple linen shirt and slacks, practical yet elegant, much like the woman herself. There was something undeniably compelling about her. I could see what had drawn Harold back after all these years. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, settling into her chair with natural grace. "I wasn't sure you would. Curiosity can be a powerful motivator." I replied, studying her openly. I have questions only you can answer. She nodded, accepting this without defensiveness. Ask anything. After what's happened, you deserve complete honesty. The waiter interrupted briefly to take our orders. Herbal tea for both of us. An unexpected commonality that felt strangely significant. When did you realize Harold was still married? I began once we were alone again. It was the question that had haunted me most. How much she had known about Harold's deception. Not until you stood up in that chapel, she admitted, holding my gaze steadily. I asked specifically when we reconnected. He told me you'd been divorced for over a year, that it had been amicable but that you preferred not to discuss it because you found it painful. The calculated nature of Harold's lies stunned me anew. And you never questioned that? Never found it odd that none of our mutual acquaintances mentioned a divorce? A shadow crossed Patricia's face. I moved back to town only recently, after Edward died. My social connections here are limited mostly to the art world. And Harold. She hesitated, seemingly choosing her words carefully. Harold suggested we keep our relationship private until we were ready to announce our engagement. He said it would be more respectful to you that way. I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. Respectful. That's rich. In retrospect, yes, she agreed, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I feel incredibly foolish. Edward and I were married for 47 years. I thought I understood men, relationships. But Harold, I missed all the signs that should have been obvious. Her regret seemed genuine, which only raised more questions. Why dig into his finances after the wedding was called off? Why not just walk away? Patricia was silent for a moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. 2 reasons, she finally said. First, self-preservation. I needed to know what other lies he might have told that could affect me. And second, she met my eyes directly. Because I recognized something in you that day at the chapel. A woman who deserved the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Professional. Courtesy among the betrayed? I suggested dryly. She smiled slightly. Something like that, though my situation with Edward was different. He never betrayed me romantically. Our marriage was solid until the end. His deceptions were financial, well-intentioned, but devastating. What happened? I found myself genuinely curious about this woman who might have become Harold's second wife. Edward believed in protecting me from worry, she explained, a familiar frustration evident in her tone. So he managed our finances independently, assuring me all was well. What I discovered after his death was that he'd made a series of increasingly risky investments, trying to build our retirement fund. When the market crashed in 2008, we lost nearly everything. He spent the last decade of his life working frantically to rebuild our security, never telling me how dire our situation had become. The parallels to my own situation, a husband making unilateral decisions under the guise of protection, were striking. How did you manage? I sold our home, liquidated what assets remained, and reinvented myself professionally, she said with quiet pride. Opened the gallery, developed new expertise, lived much more modestly than we had before. It was educational. Her resilience impressed me despite my lingering resentment. And now? Your financial situation? Stable but not extravagant, she answered candidly. Which is why Harold's claims of extraordinary investment returns caught my attention. After Edward, I became something of a skeptic about financial miracles. Our conversation paused as the waiter delivered small plates of pastries neither of us had ordered. Compliments of the chef, he explained with a smile. He says it's good to see you both enjoying each other's company. After he left, Patricia looked at me questioningly. You know the chef? My nephew, I explained. He must have spotted us when we came in. Small towns, impossible to stay anonymous, she laughed softly. And here I thought I was being discreet, choosing a cafe across town. The shared moment of amusement created an unexpected ease between us, as if we were old friends rather than women connected by a man's betrayal. This arrangement Harold suggested, I said, returning to more serious matters. A marriage in name only for the sake of the legacy fund. Was that truly your idea? Patricia nodded, breaking off a piece of almond. Croissant. I've seen similar arrangements work well. My cousin and her husband haven't been romantically involved in 15 years, but they remain married for practical reasons: insurance, property holdings, established legal protections. They have separate rooms, separate social lives to some extent, but function effectively as partners in the business of living. That's very pragmatic, I observed. At our age, pragmatism has its merits, she replied simply. The romantic ideal of marriage, that consuming passion and perfect unity, perhaps that's for the young. For us, security, companionship, and dignity in our final decades might be more valuable. Her perspective was more nuanced than I had expected, acknowledging realities that few discuss openly: the changing nature of relationships as we age, the practical considerations that sometimes outweigh emotional ideals. And you suggested this. Because I let the question hang, still uncertain of her motives. Because both you and Harold deserve security in your later years, regardless of his appalling behavior, she said directly. The legacy fund represents significant financial protection that would be diminished for both of you through divorce. It seemed wasteful to sacrifice that because of Harold's midlife crisis, for lack of a better term. I couldn't help but smile at her blunt assessment. Is that what you think happened? A midlife crisis at 70? Late life crisis, perhaps, she amended, returning my smile. Fear of mortality, fear of decline. Edward went through something similar when he turned 65. Bought a ridiculous sports car, started dressing 20 years younger. He got over it within a year. Harold bought a motorcycle, I recalled suddenly. Last summer, I thought, it was just a hobby. Patricia laughed softly. Men are remarkably predictable. The specifics change, but the pattern remains constant. That desperate grasp for youth and possibility when they feel time slipping away. The insight felt profound in its simplicity, offering a framework for understanding Harold's behavior that went beyond mere selfishness or cruelty. Not an excuse, certainly, but a context that made his actions comprehensible if not forgivable. You seem to have gained considerable wisdom from your marriage, I observed. 47 years provides ample opportunity for observation, she replied, though clearly not enough to recognize when I was being manipulated by an old flame. Both fell silent for a moment, considering the complex man who connected us. Harold with his contradictions, his fears, his capacity for both extraordinary deception and genuine care. There's something else we should discuss, Patricia said, finally, her tone shifting to something more serious. Something I discovered about Crestview that concerns me. My attention sharpened immediately. What about it? After learning about the legacy fund, I did some research, she explained. Crestview has an excellent reputation, but there have been some recent changes in management and ownership structure. A corporate healthcare group acquired them last year. And that's significant because the new parent company has a pattern of acquiring prestigious senior communities, maintaining the facade of premium care, while gradually reducing services and staff to increase profitability. She retrieved a folder from her bag, placing several news articles on the table between us. It hasn't happened at Crestview yet, but at other facilities they've acquired, the quality of care declined significantly within 2 to 3 years of the takeover. I scanned the articles quickly, my hospital administrator experience allowing me to recognize the warning signs immediately. Staff reductions disguised as efficiency measures, substitution of lower-cost care providers, reduced dietary options, presented as menu streamlining. This is concerning, I acknowledged, a new worry taking shape. The legacy fund commits our resources irrevocably, but there's no guarantee the quality of care will remain what Harold envisioned when he set this up. Exactly, Patricia confirmed. Which brings me to another possibility, one that might address both your marital situation and this potential care issue. I raised an eyebrow, curious despite myself. I'm listening. The legacy fund documentation specifies Crestview specifically, but there's an interesting clause on page 17, she explained, pulling out another document. In the event that Crestview becomes unsuitable or unavailable, the trustees have the authority to redirect the fund to alternative accommodations of comparable quality for the beneficiaries. And who are the trustees? I asked, beginning to see where she was heading. Harold is the primary trustee, with your son Michael as the secondary, she replied. If you could document legitimate concerns about Crestview's future quality, you might have grounds to redirect the fund toward a different solution entirely. The possibility sparked a sudden idea, one so unexpected that I almost dismissed it immediately. But the more I considered it, the more potential I saw. What if, I began slowly, instead of moving into Crestview at all, we used the fund to create our own living arrangement, one that provides the security and care we might need while allowing for greater independence? Patricia leaned forward, clearly intrigued. What kind of arrangement are you envisioning? I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. But Harold's architectural background, my healthcare administration experience, your art world connections, we have complementary skills that might allow us to create something more tailored to actual needs rather than a corporate care model. We? Patricia repeated, surprise evident in her voice. You're including me in this scenario? The question made me realize how my thinking had shifted during our conversation, moving from seeing Patricia as a rival to recognizing her as a potential ally with valuable perspective and skills. Why not? I said, surprising myself with the suggestion. You've already demonstrated more honesty and consideration than Harold has. And if we're contemplating a pragmatic approach to aging rather than a traditional one, why limit our options to conventional arrangements? Patricia studied me with new interest. What exactly are you suggesting, Margaret? I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. But perhaps something like a small community of our own design, shared resources but private spaces, professional care when needed but maximum independence, a place where aging is approached with dignity rather than decline as the default expectation. The idea was taking shape as I spoke, drawing on frustrations I'd observed throughout my hospital career. The way aging was often medicalized and institutionalized rather than supported as a natural life phase with its own possibilities. It's an intriguing concept, Patricia acknowledged, her expression thoughtful, and potentially viable with the right planning and resources. The Legacy Fund could provide the financial foundation, I continued, warming to the concept. But we'd need to convince Harold to support redirecting it. Patricia smiled slightly. Given his current circumstances, homeless, humiliated, and facing diminished options, I suspect he might be open to alternatives. The wry observation made me laugh unexpectedly. A genuine, unforced moment of humor that felt like the first real breath I'd taken in weeks. So where does this leave us? I asked when our laughter subsided. You, me, Harold, this messy situation we're in? Patricia considered the question carefully. I think it leaves us with possibilities none of us anticipated. Not a neat resolution, certainly, but perhaps something more interesting than what any of us had planned. As we finished our tea and pastries, continuing to explore the concept that had emerged between us, I felt something I hadn't expected to find in Patricia's company. A sense of potential rather than loss, of creation rather than destruction. What had begun as a meeting to understand my husband's betrayal had evolved into something far more complex and surprising. the first tentative steps toward a future I could never have envisioned when I stood up in that chapel just 2 weeks earlier. Walking back to my car afterward, I realized that Harold's betrayal, painful as it was, had inadvertently connected me with a woman whose perspective and experience might prove more valuable than the marriage I had lost. Life's strange symmetry, that sometimes our greatest wounds lead us to unexpected strengths, had never felt more apparent than in that moment. The day after my surprising connection with Patricia, I called my son Michael. He needed to know about the legacy fund situation, especially since he was listed as the secondary trustee, a detail Harold had apparently never mentioned to him either. He did what? Michael's voice rose in disbelief as I explained the financial arrangement Harold had created. At 43, Michael had inherited my practical nature and analytical mind, making him a successful corporate attorney, but sometimes quick to anger when confronted with irrationality. I know it's a lot to process, I said, trying to keep my own emotions in check. I'm still coming to terms with it myself. First, he plans to abandon you for his high school girlfriend. Then I find out he's committed most of your retirement. Savings to a senior living facility without proper consultation? Mom, this is beyond unacceptable. It's potentially criminal. We should be looking at financial elder abuse statutes. I sighed, understanding his protective instinct, but seeing a different path forward. Michael, listen to me. I'm angry too, but escalating this legally could ultimately hurt me as much as your father. The legacy fund is irrevocable. Fighting it would only deplete what resources we have left. He was silent for a moment, processing this reality. So what are you going to do? You can't possibly stay married to him after what he's done. This was the moment to share the evolving idea that had emerged from my conversation with Patricia. I'm considering a third option, I began carefully. One that might preserve the financial security while creating something more aligned with what I actually want for my later years. As I outlined the concept of redirecting the legacy fund toward creating our own senior living arrangement, one built on independence and dignity rather than institutional care, Michael's initial skepticism gradually gave way to cautious interest. It's certainly creative, he acknowledged when I finished. But redirecting the fund would require Dad's cooperation as primary trustee. After everything that's happened, do you really think he's capable of that kind of collaboration? I don't know, I admitted. But Harold has always been motivated by two things: avoiding conflict and pursuing interesting design challenges. This potential project offers both. Michael's laugh held a note of grudging respect. You've always understood him better than he deserves, Mom. After discussing legal considerations and practical next steps, Michael promised to research the redirection clause in the legacy fund documentation more thoroughly. Before ending the call, he hesitated, then asked the question I knew had been weighing on him. And what about Patricia in all this? Where does she fit into your plans? That's still evolving, I answered honestly. But she's brought more clarity to this situation than confusion. I think she might be a valuable ally rather than an adversary. That's unexpected, Michael said carefully. Trust me, no one is more surprised than I am, I assured him. Life rarely follows the paths we anticipate, especially at my age. After our call, I spent the rest of the day preparing for the conversation I needed to have with Harold. If this alternative plan had any chance of success, he would need to not just agree, but actively participate. Given his architectural background and his current precarious position, I believed he might be receptive, but nothing about the past weeks had been predictable. I texted him that evening, asking him to meet me the following day at the house. His response came quickly, a simple, "I'll be there at 10, that revealed nothing about his state of mind. That night, I slept better than I had since discovering his betrayal, perhaps because for the first time, I felt a sense of agency rather than victimhood. Whatever happened next would be shaped by my choices, not just reactions to Harold's deceptions. Harold arrived precisely at 10 the next morning, looking markedly different from when I'd last seen him. The defeated slump of his shoulders had been replaced by a wary alertness, and he'd traded his rumpled appearance for the neat, professional image he'd maintained throughout his career. He seemed to have found some equilibrium, however tentative. "Thanks. You for coming," I said, leading him to the sunroom rather than the kitchen where we'd had our last difficult conversation. The light-filled space overlooking the garden had always been conducive to creative thinking during our marriage, a neutral territory where we'd planned vacations, discussed home renovations, and navigated life's transitions. "You've spoken with Patricia," he observed as he settled into one of the wicker chairs, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes." It was illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. I took the chair opposite him, maintaining enough distance for comfort, but close enough for proper conversation. "She helped me understand some things about you and about our situation that I might not have seen otherwise." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "She did?" "She has surprising insight for someone who almost made the mistake of marrying you," I replied, allowing a hint of dry humor to surface. His lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Margaret, about the legacy fund. We need to discuss that," I interrupted. "But first, I want to ask you something important. Something I should have asked weeks ago when I first sensed you pulling away." Harold looked wary but nodded for me to continue. "What were you really looking for when you reconnected with Patricia? Not the fantasy you constructed, but the actual need underneath?" The question clearly caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, genuinely, considering rather than offering a reflexive response. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Freedom from fear," he said. "When the heart diagnosis came, all I could see ahead was decline, dependence, the gradual loss of everything that makes me, me." His fingers tapped unconsciously against the chair arm. Patricia represented a time before responsibility, before mortality felt real. I convinced myself that if I could just go back to that beginning point with her, I could somehow rewrite the story ahead. The painful honesty of his answer resonated more than I wanted to admit. The fear he described, of decline, of becoming a burden, of losing autonomy, was one I understood intimately, even if I'd chosen to face it directly rather than flee from it. "And now?" I prompted. "Now that the fantasy has collapsed?" He met my eyes directly for the first time. "Now I'm trying to face reality, all of it. The heart condition that isn't going away, the consequences of what I've done to you, the limitations of what lies ahead." A weary sigh escaped him. "I'm not doing it very gracefully yet." Something in his vulnerability, not performed for sympathy, but simply stated as truth, softened my approach slightly. "I have a proposition for you, Harold. One that addresses our practical situation while potentially offering something neither of us had considered." His eyebrows rose in surprise, but he remained silent, waiting for me to continue. Over the next 30 minutes, I outlined the concept that had begun to take shape during my conversation with Patricia and solidified overnight, redirecting the legacy fund away from Crestview toward creating our own living arrangement that would provide security without institutional constraints. "The corporate takeover of Crestview gives us legitimate grounds for redirection under the fund terms," I explained, showing him the research Patricia had compiled. "And your architectural expertise, combined with my healthcare administration background, positions us uniquely to design something better suited to actual needs rather than corporate profit models." As I spoke, I watched a transformation occur in Harold's expression, from cautious skepticism to growing interest, and finally to genuine engagement. By the time I finished, he was leaning forward in his chair, the familiar look of creative problem-solving, animation his features. "It could work," he said, almost to himself. a small-scale community with private residences but shared resources for care and support. He reached for the notepad I'd strategically placed nearby, beginning to sketch. Rough concepts. The zoning on the Peterson property at the edge of town would allow for this kind of development. It's been on the market for months, 5 acres with that historic farmhouse that could be converted to common spaces. For a moment, I glimpsed the Harold I had known for decades, the passionate architect who came alive when presented with a design challenge that aligned with his values. This was the man I had married, not the deceptive stranger who had planned to abandon me. "You realize what you're suggesting, though?" he said, looking up from his sketching. "It would require us to work together extensively. After everything that's happened, are you sure that's something you want?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly over the past 24 hours. "I'm suggesting a professional collaboration, Harold, not a reconciliation. Your architectural skills and knowledge of the Legacy Fund are essential to making this work. My healthcare experience and administrative background provide the other half of the expertise needed." "And Patricia?" he asked cautiously. "Where does she fit into this scenario? She brings valuable perspectives on aging independently, connections in the community, and, frankly, better financial acumen than either of us have demonstrated recently," I answered, keeping my tone matter of fact. "The three of us have complementary skills that could create something truly innovative, if we can move beyond the personal complications." Harold set down his pen, studying me with newfound respect. "This is not the response I expected from you, Margaret. After what I did, I thought that I'd either fall apart or pursue punitive divorce proceedings," I suggested. "Either would be understandable reactions, but neither would address the practical realities we're facing or create anything positive from this situation." "Your pragmatism always was your strength," he observed quietly. "Not pragmatism alone," I corrected. "Vision, the ability to see possibilities beyond conventional responses. That's something we once shared, before you lost sight of it in your fear of aging." He accepted this assessment without defensiveness, a small but significant indication of growth. "So how would this work practically? Where do we start?" "First, you need to speak with Michael about the Legacy Fund redirection. As trustees, you'll need to document the concerns about Crestview's corporate takeover and the potential decline in care quality." I handed him a folder containing the research Patricia had compiled. "Then we need to evaluate whether the Peterson property is actually suitable or if there are better alternatives." "And our living arrangements in the interim?" he asked, the question hovering between personal and practical. "You'll stay at the hotel for now," I said firmly. "This collaborative project doesn't change the fundamental breach of trust in our marriage. Whether some form of reconciliation is possible in the future remains to be seen, but it's not my priority at the moment." He nodded, accepting these terms without argument. "And do we involve Patricia in the initial planning stages, or wait until we have a more concrete concept?" The question highlighted the unusual nature of our situation, collaborating with the woman he had nearly married while still legally married to me. In any normal circumstance, it would be absurd. But our circumstances had moved well beyond normal. Weeks ago, "I think we should meet, the three of us, to establish parameters and expectations," I said after considering the question. "Complete transparency will be essential if this has any chance of succeeding." Harold gathered the materials I'd prepared, tucking them carefully into his briefcase. "I'll review everything and call Michael today. And Margaret—" He hesitated, seemingly uncertain whether to continue. "Yes?" "Thank you for finding a way forward that allows me to contribute rather than just face consequences. It's more than I deserve, and I recognize that." The simple acknowledgement was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me in months. Not a grand apology or emotional plea, but a clear-eyed recognition of the opportunity being offered. "This isn't about what you deserve, Harold," I replied evenly. It's about creating something worthwhile from a difficult situation. The senior living options available to people our age are largely inadequate, either sterile medical environments or manufactured communities that ignore the realities of aging. If our personal upheaval can lead to a better alternative, at least something meaningful will have come from it. As he prepared to leave, Harold paused at the sunroom doorway. Patricia mentioned something unexpected yesterday, that she thinks highly of you, that under different circumstances you might have been friends. The observation hung in the air between us, highlighting the strange triangle that now connected three people in their 60s and 70s. Not the passionate drama of younger love triangles, but something more complex, shaped by decades of experience and a clear-eyed view of the limited road ahead. Life rarely follows the narratives we expect, I said finally. 3 weeks ago, I crashed your wedding to expose your betrayal. Today, we're discussing a collaborative project that might benefit all of us. If nothing else, it proves that endings aren't always what they seem. After Harold left, I sat alone in the sunroom, watching butterflies move through the garden we had created together over decades. The future I had imagined for us was gone, shattered by Harold's deception. But in its place, something unexpected was taking shape. Not a fairy tale ending, but a thoughtful reimagining of what might still be possible in the final chapters of our lives. What I couldn't know then, as I sat contemplating this strange new path forward, was that the meeting between the three of us would yield revelations none of us had anticipated, leading to an arrangement that would raise eyebrows throughout our social circle, but ultimately create a model others would seek to emulate. 3 days later, I hosted what was perhaps the most unusual meeting of my life. My husband of 42 years, the woman he had nearly married behind my back, and I gathered around the dining room table that had witnessed 4 decades of family celebrations, heated discussions, and quiet Sunday breakfasts. Patricia arrived first, bringing architectural magazines featuring innovative senior living concepts and a bottle of excellent Pinot Noir. For after the meeting, she explained with a knowing smile. She had dressed professionally but comfortably, projecting the calm competence that I was beginning to recognize as her natural state. Harold arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a portfolio of preliminary sketches and site analyses of the Peterson property. He had taken our discussion seriously, his architectural instincts clearly engaged by the challenge. "Shall we begin?" I suggested after awkward pleasantries had been exchanged. "I think we need to establish ground rules for this collaboration, given our unusual personal connections." Patricia nodded appreciatively. Boundaries and expectations, essential for any complex project, especially one with our history. "Agreed," Harold said, setting up his materials with the methodical precision that had characterized his professional life. "I suggest we start by clarifying our individual roles and contributions." The business-like approach helped dispel some of the awkwardness, allowing us to focus on practical matters rather than emotional complexities. We spent the first hour defining the scope of what we were tentatively calling the Transitions Project, AE, small-scale senior living community designed around principles of independence, dignity, and interconnection. "The Peterson property has real potential," Harold explained, spreading out satellite images and preliminary site analyses. The historic farmhouse could be converted to common spaces, dining, activities, perhaps a library and media room. The 5 acres provide ample space for 6 to 8 private cottages arranged to create a sense of community while preserving privacy. Each cottage would need universal design elements, I noted, drawing on my healthcare administration experience. 0 threshold entries, accessible bathrooms, good lighting, flexible spaces that could accommodate changing needs over time. Patricia leaned forward, studying the images. "What about care services? That's the critical element that distinguishes this from simply building a small neighborhood." "That's where the legacy fund becomes instrumental," I explained. "Rather than paying for institutional care at Crestview, We could restructure it to provide for shared care resources, a nursing coordinator who visits regularly, emergency response systems, transportation services. As we discussed practical details, zoning requirements, construction timelines, care models, the initial tension gradually dissolved into something resembling a professional collaboration. Harold's architectural expertise, Patricia's financial and administrative acumen, and my healthcare knowledge created a surprisingly effective synergy. By the second hour, we were huddled over site plans, debating the optimal arrangement of cottages to balance community connection with privacy, so engrossed in the creative process that we momentarily forgot the complicated circumstances that had brought us together. "We need to address the elephant in the room," Patricia said finally, as we took a brief break for coffee. "The personal dynamics between us. How do we prevent those from derailing this project?" The direct question brought us back to the reality of our situation. A wife, her straying husband, and his almost bride now attempting to create something together. Complete transparency, I suggested. No private discussions about the project between any two of us that exclude the third. All communications copied to everyone. And clear separation between project work and personal matters, Harold added. Whatever is happening between us individually stays outside of project meetings and decisions. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. And what about living arrangements during development? Assuming the Peterson property works out, we're looking at 8-10 months of construction minimum. The question highlighted the practical realities we still needed to navigate. Harold had been living at the Lakeside Hotel for weeks, an expensive temporary solution that couldn't continue indefinitely. "I have a suggestion," Patricia said, when neither Harold nor I immediately responded. "My house has a fully finished guest apartment above the garage, separate entrance, complete kitchen, about 800 square feet. Harold could stay there during the project development. It would be cost-effective and would facilitate our collaboration without." She glanced between us. Inappropriate personal entanglement. The solution was practical, but the implications were complex. Harold living in Patricia's property, even in a separate apartment, would certainly raise eyebrows in our social circle. Yet the arrangement made logical sense for the project. "What do you think, Margaret?" Harold asked, his tone careful. "I realize it's an unusual suggestion, but from a purely practical standpoint, I considered the proposal, weighing emotional reactions against practical considerations. If we're committed to transparency, I think it could work," I said finally. "But we need to be clear with everyone, Michael, our friends, the wider community, about the nature of the project and the professional basis of our arrangement." "Absolutely," Patricia agreed quickly. "I have no interest in being perceived as the other woman in a continuing drama. This is about creating something innovative and important, not about personal relationships." Harold nodded, relief evident in his expression. "I'll speak with Michael first, make sure he understands the situation fully. As for the rest of our social circle," he shrugged slightly, "at our age, perhaps we've earned the right to prioritize meaningful work over conventional appearances." The comment surprised me, a glimpse of a perspective Harold had rarely expressed during our marriage, when social standing and professional reputation had always been paramount concerns for him. We returned to the practical aspects of the project, reviewing timelines and next steps. Harold would meet with the Peterson property owner to discuss our interest and potential terms. Patricia would research comparable projects nationally to inform our planning. I would explore care models and regulatory requirements based on my healthcare background. As the meeting drew to a close after nearly 3 hours of productive discussion, I found myself experiencing an unexpected emotion: excitement. Despite the painful circumstances that had led to this moment, the project taking shape held genuine promise, not just for our personal situations, but potentially as a model for others seeking alternatives to traditional senior living options. "Shall we open that wine now?" Patricia suggested as we gathered our materials. I think we've earned it after such a productive session. The suggestion would have been unimaginable 3 weeks earlier, sharing wine with the woman my husband had planned to marry. Yet in the context of our evolving collaboration, it felt almost natural. Over glasses of excellent Pinot Noir, our conversation shifted slightly, moving from strictly professional to more reflective. I keep thinking about how unlikely this scenario would have seemed a month ago, Patricia observed, swirling her wine thoughtfully. The three of us working together to create something meaningful after what could have been a devastating ending. For all involved. Life has a way of surprising us, especially at our age, I replied. Just when we think we understand the story we're living, the narrative shifts completely. Harold, who had been quieter during this more personal exchange, spoke up unexpectedly. I've been thinking about why I made the choices I did, not to excuse them, but to understand them. He looked down at his barely touched wine. I think I've spent most of my life running from mortality, first through achievement, then through creating things that would outlast me, and finally, when that wasn't enough, through the illusion of starting over. The candid self-assessment caught both Patricia and me by surprise. This level of introspection had rarely been Harold's strength. What changed? Patricia asked gently. Everything, he said simply. Losing the respect of the woman I've shared my life with for 42 years. Watching a new relationship collapse because it was built on deception. Facing the reality that I have perhaps 10, 15 years left if I'm fortunate. His gaze moved between us. But mostly, seeing how both of you have responded to a situation I created, with dignity, creativity, and a focus on building something worthwhile, rather than just assigning blame. The vulnerability in his admission created a moment of genuine connection among the three of us, not romantic or even purely friendly, but a recognition of shared humanity in the face of aging, mortality, and the search for meaning in our final decades. So, what do we call ourselves? Patricia asked after a moment, lightening the mood slightly. Business partners seems inadequate. Co-developers? Collaborators? How about pioneers? I suggested, surprising myself with the optimism in my voice. We're mapping new territory here, not just in senior living design, but in how people are. Age might create unconventional solutions to shared challenges. The term resonated with all of us, acknowledging that what we were attempting extended beyond building physical structures to reimagining social ones as well. As Patricia and Harold prepared to leave an hour later, we had not only a clear plan for next steps on the project, but also the tentative foundation of a new kind of relationship, not defined by traditional roles of wife, husband, or romantic rival, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. Standing at the door as they departed, separately, Patricia to her gallery and Harold to begin packing for his move from the hotel to her garage apartment, I felt a strange sense of peace descend. The future remained uncertain, the wounds of betrayal still fresh, but a path forward had emerged that held more promise than I could have imagined when I stood up in that chapel just 3 weeks earlier. That evening, I called Michael to update him on our unusual arrangement. His initial skepticism was expected, his protective instincts as a son naturally engaged by the situation. Mom, are you sure about this? He asked after I explained the collaboration and Harold's planned move to Patricia's garage apartment. It seems complicated, to say the least. Life at 70 is complicated, Michael, I replied, finding unexpected humor in the understatement. Conventional solutions don't always address unconventional circumstances. But working with the woman Dad almost married? Living in her property? People will talk. Let them, I said with a newfound indifference to social opinion that surprised even me. At my age, creating something meaningful matters more than avoiding gossip. After our call ended, I sat in the garden as twilight descended. considering the strange journey of the past month. From the shock of discovering Harold's betrayal, to crashing a wedding, to now collaborating on an innovative living arrangement. With both Harold and Patricia, none of it followed any script I could have imagined. Yet in the ruins of what had been destroyed, something new and potentially valuable was emerging, not just for the three of us, but perhaps for others facing the challenges of aging with dignity and purpose. What I couldn't know then, sitting in the gathering darkness of my garden, was that our unusual collaboration would not only transform our own lives in unexpected ways, but would ultimately create a model that would change how many viewed the possibilities for their final decades. 3 weeks had passed since our initial planning meeting, and remarkably, the transitions project was progressing with unexpected momentum. Harold had secured an option to purchase the Peterson property, Michael had built a solid legal case for redirecting the legacy fund, and Patricia had connected us with experts in innovative senior care models. But the most profound developments weren't on paper or in legal documents. They were in the subtle shifts occurring between the three of us. On this particular morning, I arrived at Patricia's gallery where we'd established our temporary project headquarters in her spacious back room. Harold was already there, bent over architectural drawings, completely absorbed in the work that had always been his true passion. "Good morning," I said, setting down coffee for the three of us. A small ritual I'd started, bringing Harold's Americano and Patricia's oat milk latte alongside my regular drip. Patricia emerged from her office, elegant as always in a simple linen dress. "Perfect timing," she said, accepting her coffee with a grateful smile. "The care consultant just sent over her recommendations for staffing models. I think you'll be particularly interested in her approach to maintaining independence while providing escalating support." As we settled into what had become our natural working rhythm, I marveled at how smoothly our collaboration functioned despite its unusual origins. Harold's architectural vision, Patricia's organizational skills, and my healthcare knowledge complemented each other in ways none of us had anticipated. "The zoning board meeting is scheduled for next Thursday," Harold announced, looking up from his plans. "Based on preliminary discussions, I think we'll get approval for the modified use permit. The historical preservation elements we've incorporated have been particularly well received." "Michael called this morning," I added. "The Legacy Fund trustees have responded positively to our redirection proposal. They've requested a formal presentation, but he believes we have a strong case given the documented concerns about Crestviews' corporate takeover." As we reviewed progress and next steps, I realized how much had changed in such a short time. The betrayal that had shattered my world had somehow led to this moment of creative purpose and unexpected connection. The painful irony wasn't lost on me, that Harold's attempted deception had ultimately created something more authentic than our marriage had been in years. "I think we should discuss something important," Patricia said as our work session wound down. "The cottage assignments. We've been dancing around this topic, but we need to address it directly." She was right. Our plans included 6 private cottages surrounding the renovated farmhouse that would serve as community space. While we'd discussed general designs and layouts, we'd avoided the personal question of who would live where once construction was completed. "You're right," I acknowledged. "It's time to have that conversation." Harold set down his pen, his expression cautious. "I've been thinking about this as well. Given our circumstances, I believe clarity about living arrangements is essential." The moment felt significant, acknowledging the personal dimensions of our project after weeks of focusing primarily on its practical aspects. "I'd like one of the smaller cottages," I said, breaking the momentary silence. "The east-facing one with the reading nook." Harold nodded, unsurprised by my choice. "That suits you. The morning light would be perfect for your reading habits." "I'm drawn to the northwest cottage," Patricia said. "The one with the studio space where I could continue my painting." We both looked at Harold, waiting for his preference. "I've been considering the southern cottage," he said carefully. "The one set slightly apart from the others. It seems appropriate given the circumstances. The subtle acknowledgement of his position in our unusual triangle hung in the air. Not quite an outsider, but not fully integrated either. Actually, I found myself saying, I had another thought about the arrangements, one we haven't discussed yet. They both looked at me expectantly. What if we considered more flexible living arrangements? I suggested. Not just separate cottages, but spaces designed for evolving needs and relationships. What exactly are you proposing? Patricia asked, her head tilted with interest. The cottages could have connecting pathways, shared gardens, even optional connecting doorways between some units that could be opened or closed depending on circumstances. The idea was forming as I spoke. As we age, our needs will change. There may be times when privacy is paramount, and others when proximity and support become more important. Harold was nodding slowly, the architect in him engaged by the concept. Adaptable boundaries rather than fixed ones. It's an interesting approach. It reflects the reality of aging, I continued. The need for both independence and connection, often in changing measures over time. Patricia studied me thoughtfully. This isn't just about architecture, is it, Margaret? You're talking about our personal boundaries as well. Her perceptiveness didn't surprise me anymore. Over these weeks of collaboration, I'd come to appreciate her emotional intelligence as much as her practical skills. Yes, I admitted. I think we need to acknowledge that what we're creating here isn't just a physical space, but a new kind of relationship, one that doesn't fit conventional categories. Harold set down his coffee, his expression serious. What kind of relationship are you envisioning, Margaret? It was the question I'd been asking myself for days, ever since I noticed how our working dynamics had evolved into something that felt surprisingly comfortable and right. I'm not entirely sure, I answered honestly. But I know it's not as simple. As divorced spouses or business partners or conventional friends, we've been through something extraordinary together. Betrayal, confrontation, and now creation. That creates a bond that doesn't fit neat definitions. Patricia's smile held a hint of wonder. You know, when I moved back to town after Edward died, I never imagined finding connection again. Certainly not in these circumstances. But there's something about what we're building, both literally and figuratively, that feels more authentic than many conventional relationships I've known. Harold looked between us, a complex emotion crossing his face. I never deserved this outcome, he said quietly. After what I did, the most I hoped for was civil interaction for practical purposes. This is something I couldn't have imagined. None of us could have imagined this, I pointed out. 3 weeks ago, I crashed your wedding to expose your betrayal. Today, we're designing a community we'll all live in. Life rarely follows the narratives we expect. As the afternoon light slanted through the gallery windows, we allowed ourselves to openly discuss what had been developing beneath the surface of our collaboration, a complex, undefined relationship between 3 people in their later years, bound together initially by betrayal, but increasingly by mutual respect and shared purpose. So what do we call this? Harold asked. This arrangement? This relationship? Does it need a name? Patricia responded. At our age, haven't we earned the right to create connections that serve our actual needs rather than social expectations? Her question resonated deeply with me. Throughout my life, I had followed conventional paths: dutiful daughter, dedicated wife, involved mother, successful professional. Only now, in my 7th decade, was I discovering the freedom to define relationships on my own terms. I propose, we call it chosen family, I suggested. Not bound by traditional roles or expectations, but by conscious choice and shared vision. The term settled comfortably between us, acknowledging both our complex history and evolving future. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, we stood together on the Peterson property as construction officially began on what we now called transitions community. The local paper had sent a reporter, intrigued by both the innovative senior living concept and the unusual trio behind it. "Mrs. Wilson," the young reporter asked me, "what inspired this unique approach to senior living?" I glanced at Harold and Patricia, standing comfortably beside me in the morning sunlight. "Life rarely follows the path we expect," I answered, truthfully. "Sometimes the greatest opportunities emerge from our most difficult challenges." "And your relationship with your husband and Ms. Sullivan?" she asked, the question delicate but direct. "The community has been curious about your unusual arrangement." I smiled, beyond caring about social judgment. "We're pioneers in more ways than one," I replied, "creating not just innovative living spaces but new kinds of relationships that meet actual needs rather than social expectations." The groundbreaking ceremony that followed was small but meaningful. Michael and his family, several friends who had supported us through the tumultuous past months, local officials who had helped navigate zoning requirements. As Harold symbolically turned the first shovelful of earth, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us here. Later that evening, the three of us sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset over what would soon become our community. Harold had brought champagne to celebrate the milestone, and Patricia had prepared a simple dinner we shared as dusk settled around us. "If someone had told me 6 months ago that this is where I'd be today," Patricia mused, "I would have thought they were writing fiction." "Life is stranger than fiction," I agreed. "And infinitely more surprising." Harold raised his glass in a toast. "To unexpected journeys and second chances. Or third chances in my case." As we clinked glasses in the gathering darkness, I reflected on the extraordinary path that had led us here. From the shock of discovering Harold's betrayal to the dramatic confrontation at the chapel to this moment of peaceful collaboration, none of it followed any script I could have imagined for my later years. Yet in the ruins of what had been destroyed, something new and valuable had emerged, not just for the three of us, but potentially for others seeking more authentic ways to navigate aging with dignity and connection. The conventional ending to my story might have been righteous anger, bitter divorce, and lonely independence. Instead, I had found my way to something far more interesting: a chosen family created from the ashes of betrayal, a meaningful project born from crisis, and a future that, while unconventional, promised both purpose and connection in my remaining years. As darkness fell completely over the land that would soon transform into our shared vision, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected to find again. The 3 harsh truths I had delivered in that chapel had shattered illusions and exposed deceptions. But in doing so, they had cleared the ground for something more authentic to grow. Sometimes, I reflected as we sat companionably in the darkness, the most powerful truth is that endings aren't always what they seem. What appears to be the final chapter can instead be the unexpected beginning of a story far more interesting than the one we thought we were living. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.